Trying to let everybody in. Get everybody in here. Hey, Chucky. Good morning, everybody. Good morning. It's like easier to type it, huh? It is, it is. Let's see, there's Ethan. Let's see. Garrett, don't forget to put that. Oh, you're here. I already marked you. Why? Other Garrett. Garrett Williams. Don't forget to put remote by your name on the Zoom session so that I can mark you as out of class. Otherwise, I'm looking for you and I can't find you. Thank you, sir. Okay, so we're missing Chris and Matt. You guys are here, let me know. Unless I'm counting you out. Save it. Everybody's here bright and early. Well, not quite bright and early. It's already 8:06. Hey, wanted to say, hey, I am actually here because I never turn on the camera. All right, I'll turn it back off. Let's share some stuff. Cancel this. First of all, you guys did a great job last time. We've kind of a crash course in all things SQL, and you just went through a lot of those problems and got a lot of it resolved. Definitely a lot of good practice. We need more practice, but you guys are actually really showing a lot of good experience. Whenever we do, get Greg in here. Whenever we do demos like that where you're kind of following along, I know it can be a little frustrating, but it really does help you to understand how all the pieces fit together, I think. So where we are, I've made a few updates, and hopefully I've got them in there properly because between the two systems, they're giving me some trouble. The problems that we were working on last time, 727 through 755, we're going to look at the problems that require a subquery today. So there's definitely some things in there that we haven't talked about yet. It's already confusing enough. And we'll talk about those subqueries so that you can finish those up. But I changed the due date to next Tuesday. So that gives you a little bit more time to get through those if you were moving at a little bit of a slower pace. Remember, as you run through them, you have so many examples. You have the examples we've done together in class. Now that, that's why it's so important to try to name those files in a way that's meaningful to you as to what the example is. We have examples in the PowerPoint, not as many, but we do have quite a few. And then the videos that are posted are pretty much those same example queries, me going through them again. So you can look at those different places. Whenever we're looking at the PowerPoint, it does have some really good slides where it really emphasizes the keywords. So that can be helpful to you. I brought up my OneNote document because we've been working so hard on queries. I don't know if everybody's been able to update that. So bring up your OneNote document and check to make sure that you got that huge Chapter 7 PowerPoint imported into it, and kind of scroll through a little bit. because as you go, today we're going to talk about the having clause in our aggregate functions. So I believe that looks like it's slide 28, at least it's numbered 28 down there at the bottom. So we've moved quite a ways through that content. We'll finish up with these aggregate queries, looking at the having clause, and then we'll move on into our subqueries. Oh, and Jackie's got some comments too, guys. W3 Schools also has some practice screen format type things, interactive utilities that you can use, and they have some really, really good examples too. So all sorts of different examples, and that's kind of the way SQL is. It's kind of, you know, we don't have a lot of different syntax, do we? It's more our data that messes with us, and we found that, you know, where if we don't know exactly what something is intended to be, we might not know how to format the query. We might have to do some experimenting about it a little bit. We had our guest speakers, and usually when I have guest speakers, I try to find somebody who's pretty specific to the field. But those guys were so available and so dynamic, I wanted them to come talk to you. But I do have another friend I want to tell you a little bit about. She won't be a big guest speaker for me anymore. She did it for a few years, and she's like, I'm not doing that anymore. Okay, I can't blame her. She works in Monette, and her job is SQL, SQL, that's it. That's what she does. She doesn't do anything else. She used to work for a railroad in Pittsburgh, Kansas, and my friend is a really good negotiator. So she's able to get her salary in Southeast Kansas up well over $100,000 a year, which is pretty good for a woman in Southeast Kansas, Southwest Missouri. So she worked there for several years. Then she decided that she didn't really want to work there anymore, and she went to this company in Monette. So she doesn't make as much, and I haven't asked her how much she makes because it does make me a little sick, you know, just a little sad. I'm very happy for her, but sad for others. But I know she's making 100,000 or so, and she does SQL. That's what she does. So she said the company that she works for is like a middleman. So all they do is buy and sell ingredients to that Blue Diamond dog food company that is in Joplin. And so they buy dog food ingredients for Blue Diamond to use to make the dog food. And so that's pretty much all they do is buy and sell stuff. And so they're really, you know, doing really well. She said that there were times that she feels really guilty because she'll sit there the whole week and not really have anything to do. And she talked to the president of the company, who was a friend of ours that we used to work with. And she said, Brian, you know, should I leave? I mean, we've got stuff going on in the company. There's financial issues. Should I leave? Is this something that I should go ahead and retire or whatever? You guys don't need me. Are you going to get rid of me? Is basically her question. And Brian said, when we need you, the job function that you perform is so critical that we're willing to have you sit for weeks on end so that when we do need you, you can do that and make that report and generate that data that we need so badly because she is such an expert in that field. So SQL is good. It's a very, very, very good skill to have. It's handled Teresa's life really, really well, but she really enjoys doing it. So because there are some little nuances like that, there are some times that it can kind of do a getcha. That's why it's a really, really valued skill. And it's something that we want to have a lot of knowledge about. We also want to remember that it's pretty, what I want to say, it's pretty limited in its capability. And that's why sometimes we have to really work to get things formatted properly to get the data out the way that we want, because we don't have a lot of different syntax capabilities. So if we look at the stuff that we've learned so far, we know we have the select clause, and then we list all of the columns that we want. We know then that we have the from clause, and we list all the tables to find that data from. And we've seen some additions we can make to that from clause, like the join clauses. We say, you know, what columns to use to join on. And then everything else with SQL, based on the square brackets here, is optional, right? So that's all we really have to have is the select from. So it can be a really friendly, simple language at first. But then we can add our where clause to say we only want things that meet a certain criteria. And then we saw with our summary queries, we could use summarizing functions in our column list to cause summary queries to be generated. And then we can specify what other columns to group by. So I want a list of all of the invoices for this vendor. I can group by vendor number and squish them all together, group them, and get that total. Now we can add a having clause to that to say I only want vendors that having a certain amount or a certain value or some other sort of criteria. We can sometimes use the where clause to limit our output, but if we're working with an aggregate function, we have to use the having clause. So if that's part of our aggregation. And then of course we saw at the very end, no matter what kind of complicated things we're doing, at the very end we can sort our output data with our order by clause. So remember, that's what we're limited to. We don't have a billion different syntax choices, so we have to stay pretty limited. So let's open SQL Server Manager and let's try some having clause summary queries. Okay. I think that I have it open, and I'm going to make sure that I'm connecting to my CIS250 server. You guys doing okay this morning? Everybody's quiet.
A little tired. Doing pretty good.
Been a long week, hasn't it? They just keep going and going. I've got to get my other one open here. Let's go back to where we were. I'm going to go, we're working with the AP database. If we expand and look at its tables, we can kind of remember what tables we have in this database. It has to do with vendors and invoices, people that we're buying things from. So if you notice with the textbook, anytime they're talking about any sort of business type functions, like accounting type things, internal business operations, they always have the invoices and line items and customers, and you'll get real used to seeing things like that. Our textbook does a really good job of giving us some variety though, seeing like the library system and just a little bit that's a little different. Okay, let me get started here. I want to use this AP database. And for our first one today, let's try a summary query. And for this one, we're going to use the group by. And we're going to group by 2 columns. So we're going to get our vendor state and city, and we're going to count how many invoices we have gotten from different vendors in that city and state. I gotta bring up the picture. Let me find it. Our vendor table has all of that information contained on it, except for how many invoices that vendor has had. So we're going to have to use both of those tables to gather the information that we need. We're going to, like I said, count invoices and the average invoice by city and state. Count invoices. Yeah. So for every city and state that we have a vendor in, we're going to get a count of how many invoices we've had for that city and state and what the average invoice amount is. So for our select clause, we know that we're going to be working from our invoices table. And we're going to use that as a starting point because we're looking at that invoice information. We want to know how many of them there were. But we're going to join that to our vendors table. I'll go down to the next line to do the on clause. Of course, you guys are developing your kind of own preference for how you set these up. That's fine, as long as it's readable. And we want this join to be on our vendor ID because we're going to be counting by that information. Now I'm going to add in my columns. We want vendor state, vendor city. Now, in order to count how many invoices there were, should I use the sum function? If I want to count, I should use count. And notice how these requirements that you're given, and even when you're at work, the requirements that you're given, people are going to say words like that. And you can know that that's something that you can use. If they want to count how many of these there are, you're always going to use that count function. We might have to use it a little bit differently, specify different fields, but in this case, we want to count every invoice. We want to give those a name, invoice QTY. And then we want the average of the invoice total column, caps lock there. And we're going to call that invoice AVG. Now, right now, if I try to run this, I'm going to get an error. It says that very first column, vendor state, is invalid because it's not contained in an aggregate function or the group by clause. So you guys have seen already, that means put it in the group by clause. If you want it to show up in your output, we have to use it as a summary column. So my group by clause is going to come after my from clause. So I know I have to add in vendor state because the error message told me that. If I try and run it again, I'm going to get the same error message, only this time it's going to be about the city. Because again, I can't have any detail level items occurring in an aggregate query. I have to use them as group by fields. So I can set both of those up as my group by, and then they'd like us to order by those same fields, which makes sense. So let's run that. So I could do some things to make sure this was accurate.
So, okay, why? So I understand that whenever you have something that's summarizing something like a count for average, can be group by for statements that aren't being used in that summary. But what is group by actually doing?
It's saying that I want you to do, whenever you're counting and averaging, I want to see a count and average for every unique vendor state.
Oh, okay.
And then within that, every unique vendor city. So it's kind of like just clumping things based on those columns. Does that make sense?
Sure. If you change the order, so if you change the group by to vendor city and then vendor state, would that change the output?
Uh-huh. Let's try it. That's a good question. Now, I'm not going to change the sort. Did it matter? We'd have to find, I don't think it should, because Fresno, California is always going to be in Fresno, California. So the only time it would matter would be like if we had Fresno in California and in Massachusetts. Then we would get a different group by results from changing the order. Can you see that? It helps if you visualize it, and I wish that I could find a really good way. We're going to putting some data into Excel, but right now it's rejecting me. Okay, so yeah, the really good question. So the only time the group by is going to affect the output is when you have items that are in more than one category of that you're grouping by. I'm going to put that back. Let's save that one. Hey, Chris. So we'll say group by city, state. Because that is kind of a common grouping, but it doesn't give us the same sort of data feel as when we're working with numbers and invoices and things that where we have that kind of crossover. Now let's add a having clause to this because we haven't really messed with those. So I'm gonna copy this query and open a new query window. So I want to update our comments. This is going to be a summary query that groups by 2 columns, but it's going to include a having clause. So we can do our having clause in a lot of different ways, kind of like the where clause. We've seen that we can use equal sign, we can use like functions like or matches or in, all sorts of different capabilities. Our having clause is the same way, where we can say, you know, having vendor ID equals 7, or we can say having some sort of summary data characteristic. And in this case, we want to see cities and states only if we have more than one invoice. So we don't want to see all of those ones where we were only getting one. So we're going to add a having clause and say, we want to group by vendor, city, and state, but we only want those groups to be output that have a count of greater than 2, greater than or equal, sorry. Let's run that. So we should see we've eliminated that first state. What was it, Arizona? I could run that again real easy without my having clause to verify. So there's our Arizona that only has 1 invoice. And then if I add our having clause, I've eliminated that one because it does not meet that criteria. So let's think about how we can verify that we have the right stuff. Whenever we're looking at this kind of query, I could come in and I'm going to do a copy of my select statement. Whoops, I want to include my from clause. So I'm going to copy this whole thing. And I'm just going to paste it down here further in this query window. Now, when I include the count, that makes it into a summary query, and so I can't see any of the detailed data behind it. So I'm going to comment that out. Same thing with the average. So instead of getting an average, I'm just going to look at the invoice total. I want to only run this query, so I'm going to select it here in this window. When I select code in the Management Studio window, it will ignore all of the other code and only run what's selected. So I've got this select statement here. I'm going to go ahead and execute it. And I think to really be sure that I'm looking at the data properly, I should add my order by clause, because otherwise I'm not sure. And again, I'll select that and just run that select statement. Now I see, looking at the top, sure enough, I have one invoice for Arizona that's $662. So I think that my summary stuff was working properly for that, but I'll double check some more. In California, for Fresno, it does look like indeed we have a lot of invoices. Kind of hard for me to verify that one, so I'll go to Oxnard. That's a nice, easy one for me to double check. I have 3 invoices, looks like 448, 550, 564 or something around that. So let me run my summary query again. Sorry if I'm flipping around. It's kind of big, I can't get it all. And I'm going to make sure that those Oxnard numbers are correct. There it is, 3 invoices. Well, I don't know about that invoice total. Oh yeah, we wanted an average, not a sum. So that looks good. That looks good. So we're okay. So we can verify that we're getting the correct data output that way by drilling a little deeper, running some additional queries to look at the detail information to make sure that our summary is correct.
So is there a difference between having and where other than at which point it executes?
Is there a what?
A difference between having and where, and other than at which point it executes. So where happens before the group by, where having happens after the group by. Is there any other difference other than that?
In your having clause, you can have the aggregate fields, okay, like this count.
Okay.
Where in your where clause,
oh, okay,
we'll be able to. So, but not a lot. It's more just that point of execution. Let's look at another one. That one is good. I want a new query, and in this query, we're going to add a search condition. I better do good comments the whole way here. So we're going to do a summary query. With a group by and a having clause. We want to know basically how many invoices and the average invoice total for each of our vendors. And that would be a real common query for us to run, something that we would set up pretty early in our system design. So we want to start out with our select clause. And we're going to be looking at our vendors table. Now, because we want to know how many invoices they have, we're going to join our invoices table. Looking at our diagram, why would we choose to start with the invoices table in the last query and start with the vendors table in this query?
I can't read that. I can't read that.
Can't read it. To get on the Zoom session, it's very small. I can zoom in anymore. Canvas doesn't like to zoom in very much. You can download it though and zoom in. But why would we want to do that? Because you don't have to really be able to read the detailed information. Really shouldn't make any difference, right? We're going to end up looking at every vendor and every invoice, and internally the database management system is going to join them, connect them on vendor ID so that it has this one huge table, and then it will do the grouping and the summarizing that we've asked to do. So either way shouldn't make any difference. There are some kind of guidelines though. A lot of people like to use the beginning table as the one that has fewer entries. Like our vendor table would have fewer entries than the invoices table. So we can approach it that way, that we're going to start our query with our vendor table. And also it's going to be our left join because we want to see all of the vendors that we have. So we want to start on it. Now our join column is again going to be our vendor ID. Now I'm going to put our column criteria in here. We want the vendor name. That's how we're going to display our information. And they wanted to know how many invoices each vendor has. So we're going to do a count and we'll name that invoice QTY. And we want an average. Now, if I commented out the vendor name, if it will let me, and ran this, I should just get one total, right? We have 114 invoices for all of our vendors, and this amount, 1879, is the average invoice amount. Now, when I add our vendor name back in, then I'll start getting that error about my aggregate and non-aggregate columns. So I better add in my group by. So now I've added in that vendor name specification. If I run this, I should see it now show me those summary detail information pieces for each vendor. Looks good. Now I'd also like to limit that result. I only want to see the people that have invoice averages greater than 500. And we'll go ahead and group them by that. Notice that, oops, sorry, order by. Notice that a lot of times our sort is going to match our having. We want that to be in descending order, so we see the people with the highest averages at the top. And of course, we could round that. Can we? Oh, I forgot. We can. Make it all pretty. So if we try to use a where clause instead,
Oh.
See if I can do it at all. And there we're saying an aggregate may not appear in the where clause unless it is in a subquery. And so we get really, really involved there. But in general, we want to use our having clause when we want to select on an aggregate column like that. So let's save that one. So I'm going to say that's group by vendor with a having. Sorry, looking at this next one, I don't think we need to do that. Lots of good stuff. Oh, here's a good one. Let's do one more query here with our summary queries. We've seen now today how we could do a sum grouped by a certain value. So like a sum of all of the invoices for a certain vendor or a sum of all of the orders for a certain customer. Those kinds of things are really valuable to us. Sometimes we need to include like a final total at the end, a sum of all of them so that they can see what the total was with a final summary row. So in this example, we're going to count all of our invoices and sum our invoice total by vendor. And then we're going to have a final total. In this query, we only need to use our invoices table because we're not going to include the vendor name. We're just going to include their ID. So we won't have to join. So we'd like the vendor ID and account. And a total. So it's not going to let me do this unless I add a group by clause to account for that vendor ID. That's not a summary field. So let's try running this like that. And we see our results that we've got our vendor ID, how many invoices they have, and the total of all of their invoices. So we're seeing who our best customers are or the people that we buy the most from. But now let's add that summary total. If I go down to the bottom, you see I've just got that last vendor ID. So I'd have to get out calculator or something to add those all up. I can add a clause to the group by and say with roll up. And adding the with roll up, go down to the very bottom. You should see your final total. So it leaves the vendor ID as null because that's a group by field that it can't do a final total on. It knows that. But then it gives you a final total of all of your summary data. So that's a special syntax we can use to get a final total out. Let's save that one. Everybody get it okay? That one's quick. So group by with final summary row. Now in the same way, we might want to list like our city-state information and then have a final summary for each state. So let's try something like that. So for each group by item, we want to have a subtotal. So I want to get this data again from our vendors table. And what we want to know is what state they're in, what city they're in. We want to count of how many vendors there are in that city and state. We'll call that count QTY vendors. How many vendors are there? That should be everything that we need. Now we're going to add a where clause because as we're passing through gathering the vendors from our table, we can eliminate the ones that do not meet this criteria. We only want New Jersey and Iowa. Now again, we could comment out our detail level columns. I've got overtype on somehow. There we go. And run this to get a final total. Just kind of see what we're working with. We should have 6 different vendors in those 2 states. And of course, we could remove our where clause if we wanted to make sure that we were really, it was working properly. Could always back up. So we've got Iowa and New Jersey selected. Perfect. Let's group our output, those counts, by that vendor state and vendor city. And we want to do that roll-up option so that we see subtotals. Again, I'm going to order it by the state, and they want us to do descending. And our city. So now of those 6 vendors, we should see how they're split up. In New Jersey, we have 1 in Washington, 1 in Fairfield, and 2 in East Brunswick. So our total for New Jersey is 4. And then we list our Iowa information. Notice we see our total for Iowa, and then at the bottom, we see our final total of those 6 vendors.
Why are we getting null values on this?
Because when you make that subtotal, the city becomes irrelevant, right? Because now we're just looking at Iowa. And then for the total, the state is irrelevant and the city is irrelevant because it's a total of everything. So that's why we're seeing those null values where that is. Good question. Let's save that one. So I'm going to say this is a group by with subtotal summary rows. So a good way for us to think about that would be, in our example, we're keeping it simple, but a good way to think about it would be like if you were working at the corporate offices for Come and Go, and you would want to be able to run a report that lists that night's sales for every Come and Go, but then they also probably just want to list that for Come and Go number such and such had this much in sales, Come and Go some such and such had this much, total for Springfield, you know, total for Missouri. And they often want to see things like that grouped in those kinds of different organizational chart type things. They might want to see a total for this regional manager, you know, of all of the different stores that they manage. So we'll see that kind of summary information being asked for all the time. Usually management people don't want to see information about every single invoice or every single order. They only want to see what was the total for this regional manager, how is he doing, how is she doing, and so we're going to be really used to running summary queries like that. Looks good, looks good. Let's look at our subqueries. We got all of our summary query stuff set. Now in our subquery, let's see what they say about it in our book, in our PowerPoint. It is the next thing. They have 3 slides about subqueries. So let's take a look at them. First of all, key characteristics. A subquery is a query or select statement inside of another query. That's very important. A subquery is normally expressed inside parentheses. That means the inner query is going to be within parentheses. The first query in the SQL statement is known as the outer query. The query inside is known as the inner query. The inner query is executed first, and then that output, the result set from that inner query, is used as input for the outer query. So we can refer to the whole SQL statement as a nested query altogether. Our subquery could return one value, like if we wanted a total and we only wanted to find invoices that exceeded some total, we could return just one value. Or it could be a list of values, like all of the states that we have vendors in. Or it could be like a virtual table, something in a memory that has multiple columns and multiple rows. And we can use that as input to our outer query to determine what data to be selected. When we're working with subqueries, we can include them in several places of our outer query. The most common type uses a subquery within a where clause. So we would say where select that average of all of the invoice totals, and then we could use that average as a selection criteria. We also have an operator called in the in subqueries, like where we said within this list, we can generate that list dynamically using a subquery. So I think you guys had one in the Cengage stuff where they wanted 3 different account numbers and you use the in specifier to give it a list. Well, we can make this list be generated dynamically from a select statement. The having clause can also be used to restrict the output by applying a subquery condition. And we have some new operators, the all and any. The all operator compares a single value with a list of values. The any operator compares a single value to a list of values and selects only the rows greater than or less than any value in the list. So we'll clarify that as we look at some examples. Our subqueries themselves can have some special characteristics. A from subquery, a from clause can specify the tables just like it does in an outer query. We're going to have attribute list subqueries where we can use certain attributes to list, they say, to list the difference between each product's price and the average product price. We'll look at some examples and see what that means. And then we can also do a correlated subquery where for every row in our outer query, we run the inner query to make some sort of selection. So we also have an exists special operator, and we'll see how that works. Let's try some examples. Whenever I'm doing subqueries, one thing that I like to do is kind of resolve the inner query first. So I'm going to set up my use statement and go. This very first subquery, we're going to use a where clause to limit our selected output, our result set. Type that. So for our query here, we're going to want all of the invoices. So list all invoices whose total, whoops, is greater than the average invoice total. So now we're saying our where clause is dependent upon data that we have to calculate, right? We don't know what the average invoice total is unless we run a select statement to get us the average invoice total. So we want to figure out how we can use that in our where clause. So I want to do my inner select first. I want to figure out how to get that average. We just did our summary queries, so I know that I can select the average of the invoice total from the invoices table. That's a summary query that doesn't have any sort of specifications. I'm going to run it, and that should give me one number that is our average invoice amount. So $1879.74. Does that look right? We could do a query and look at all of our invoices and add some things up and make sure that that was accurate. We know from looking at our data the last few days that that sounds pretty close to accurate. So I think we're good to go with that. So that's going to be our inner query. So I'm going to put parentheses around it and get that semicolon out of the way, because this is going to end up inside my outer query. So now to build my outer query, I'm going to select from our invoices table, and the columns that I want are invoice number, invoice date, and invoice total. It's very upset about this where clause, or I'm sorry, this subquery sitting here. So I'm going to add it to a where clause so that it won't be so upset. So according to our specifications, we want the invoices whose invoice total is greater than the average. I'll go ahead and put that subquery down on its own line and indent it a little bit so that it kind of stands out to me that it's a subquery. In the end, I would like to order this by our invoice total. And I'm end up with an extra semicolon there. So now using this query, our subquery is going to go out and find that number, that total, and we're going to replace this subquery with that number when the outer query is run. It's like this subquery is a parameter, and we'll replace that parameter with the results of the subquery to run our outer query. So we should see as a result only the invoices whose total exceed that average. Again, if we wanted to double check, we could comment out all of that and run it without the where clause and see all of the invoices in our system. And we see a lot of them that are way less than that average. So we know that our subquery is working properly. We shouldn't see any that are less than that. Everybody's okay for subquery? Yay. Questions about that? Do you see how the subquery is running? Its results are being used then to run the outer query. So let's save that subquery and where clause by average invoice. So let's make it a little bit more difficult. Let's add a new query, and we're going to have a subquery here. Hang on, sorry, I'm looking at something that's weird. Oh, I see it. Okay. So first off, we're going to do a query that uses an inner join. And we started out looking at all these different join types, and then our textbook was like, oh, sorry, never mind. I just wanted to get you all upset looking at all these other joins. We're only going to use the left outer join, and that's pretty much what we've done. We always say join on, and we're not worried about using any of the unusual join types, which is fine. In this case, they're going to show us a way that we could avoid using those unusual join types. So sometimes you might see some people recommend, oh, you should use an inner join, you should use a full outer left join or something like that, whatever they say. Know that the default joins that you guys have been using are the preferred kind, and that's the best to use for our database management system without causing extreme overhead on the system itself. In this example, we're going to use a join, just like we've been using an inner join. So let me stop talking and let's just do this query. I'm going to be looking at our invoice table, and I'm going to join it to our vendors table. So realize I'm going to be controlling this by looking at every single invoice in our database. So my join is going to be on that primary key foreign key pair, and the data that I want is going to be the same, our invoice number, our invoice date, and our invoice total. And we'd only like to see vendors from California. And we're going to sort it by invoice date. So in this query, the database management system is going to gather every invoice. We do have the where clause that's going to limit which invoices are pulled into the intermediate result set, but then it's going to to join on vendor ID to every vendor that we have an invoice for and output that information. So let's run it. So there's the data that we're getting out. That's using a join. Now let's change that query to use a subquery. So I'm going to put a comment down here and just keep it in the same window. The same query restated with a subquery. Just give you an idea of the different syntax capabilities and possibilities that you have. So I want to select the same row, same columns. From our invoices. Now in our where clause, we're going to be adding in the special syntax where the vendor ID is in this list. And you know, in that list, we could put a list of vendor IDs like 1, 7, 49, and that would select vendors that were in that list. We could also use a subquery to do that. So we can select vendor ID from vendors where vendor state equals CA. And then we can use our order by clause. Gotta put a closing quote there. So I want to select this and just run this newer one. I'm looking at my invoices here. I should have, like, if I'm doing the same order by, which I am, I should see this 125520-1 up at the top. I'll run it. Oh, that looks good. So sometimes, depending on the way our data is situated in our tables, we might have better results if we're using a subquery over a join. Because in this join, you're going to process every invoice that we have information for in our invoice table. If we're a very large company, we may have millions and millions of invoices for thousands and thousands of vendors. Whenever we do this sub-select down here, we're going to go through our vendor table to find the specific vendor IDs that we want. So as we scan through the invoice table, we'll have that data already. So we could result in a savings in processing overhead. And this is something that we could do some testing on for the way our database is set up, because it could be impacted depending on how the DBA has things stored, what kind of things they've done behind the scenes too. So we could try both. One might be more efficient than another. Gives you alternatives. Here's what they say. The advantages of the joins. The join can include columns from both tables. A join tends to be more intuitive when it uses an existing relationship. So like we are, yeah, it does, Jackie. Jackie's mentioning the subquery seems a little bit more reasonable to use. I don't know. But a query with a join typically performs faster than the same query with a subquery, but there's some advantages to a subquery also. A subquery could pass an aggregate value to the outer query. A subquery tends to be more intuitive when it uses an ad hoc relationship between two tables, like if I wanted to find vendors that were associated with some other non-related table. And long complex queries can sometimes be easier to code using subqueries. So you can try both. The joins are the more preferred method when you have a choice. So You can decide how you want to do it. Now let's look at vendors without invoices. Let's save this one. So this subquery is in our where clause, but instead of using the by average invoice type thing, we'll say it uses the in clause, where clause with an in, too many clauses there. Now one more before we go to the Cengage ones, or I'll let you get them done. In this query, we want to find all of the vendors that do not have invoices. So whenever we're working with data, it can be really hard to find things that don't have data. Goes against all of our logic, right? So we can have some issues with that. So in that case, sometimes it is best to use a subquery. So I'm going to start out with my inner query. I didn't do that last time, and it left me feeling a little out of sorts. So I want to start out with my inner query where I want to get all of the vendors that we have. So if I left out that distinct keyword, I would see one vendor more than once, right? Because they could have more than one invoice. But since I put in the distinct keyword, I'm only going to see each vendor ID one time. I'm going to run this inner query to make sure. And sure enough, the result set that it's coming out with is just giving me a list of vendors that have invoices, right? How do I know these vendors have invoices? Because I'm looking at the invoices table. So if I'm seeing a vendor in that invoice table, they have an invoice, right? Because they wouldn't be there if they didn't. So that is how we know that they have an invoice. So now I could use this list and I could use it to get all of the vendors that have invoices, right? But I need a special syntax to be able to use this list to get all of the vendors that are not in this list. So let's do that. We'll wrap this in our outer query. In our outer query, we're going to be looking at our vendors table. Notice our inner query is looking at our invoices table. But in our outer query, we want to get the vendor ID, the vendor name, and the vendor state from our vendor table. And I'm going to add a where clause and say where the vendor ID itself is not in this list. And the list is the list from our subquery. So our subquery comes back with a list of all of the vendors that have invoices. And then our where clause says, look at every vendor. Are they in this list? If not, I want to keep them in our result set. So I see vendor 34 right here. They should not be in our output set. Let's execute it and make sure. There's 34 missing because they do have an invoice. So we do have a lot of vendors set up that we haven't done any actual business with. Quite a few. Now they've asked you for some things like this in the Cengage queries, and we saw that we could actually use our join also to get this kind of information. So they said from vendors join invoices, and then we would know that they had an invoice. I think they were asking for ones that only had them. So this is what we would do for the reverse, where we want to find the vendors that do not have them. So let's save that. Subquery in where clause with not in Well, I think that's about enough torturous of queeriness for you guys today. Whew, you're doing so good. So the queries that go up to, let's go look at them. Any questions before I minimize this? Could get back to it real easy, no problem. But I wanted to bring up our Canvas stuff. So the 727 to 755, this is not a good enough name for me, is now due next Tuesday. So you can bring additional questions with you to class next week as you're finishing up if you run into anything. And of course, some of those sub-queries, you're gonna have to do a lot of investigating and research to get them, but they should be very similar to the few examples that we've done. I think you can get them from that. The big one, I just went ahead and changed the due date to December 10th, which is the end of the semester. And what I'm thinking is we'll just pull a couple of problems out of that giant set every week or so for us to work on together in class or to work on individually. And we'll just see if we're able to get them all done by the end of the semester. I was looking at, since this is a new textbook, it is normal for me to compare back to the old ones that's very different. And the number of queries that you guys have written is like way more than what people were writing before. They've just all been jumbled up into this one chapter. And so you've had a great opportunity to learn everything. So we need to finish up that one set of queries, but this big set, I don't want you to worry about. Don't let them be hanging over your heads. We're gonna resolve those together through class, doing a few a week until we get them all done, or we decide that we've done enough of them that everybody gets their points. So we're not gonna have that one. And I can't split it up in Cengage. If I could split it up and just, do like 5 of them or something, sure, we would do that. But since it won't let me, we're just gonna say we'll work on it for the rest of the semester and go from there. So that should be good. So for next week, get the labs done for 727 through 755. Bring any questions with you, and I'll have the content available to start reading Module 8. And I believe in Module 8, it's logged me out, of course. Like my long way here of doing it. Are they broke? I want to say that chapter 8, it says advanced SQL, and that's why I have to actually go look at it. Yeah, and make sure. But we're going to actually be doing syntax to create tables and create different components within the database. So you'll find that syntax to be pretty simple compared to the select statement syntax that you've been working with. So it'll go really fast. So we'll have that set up and start working on those. And you guys will be like, well, this is a breeze compared to doing all those select statements. So questions, you're all set. Got it? Okay, just let me know if you run into anything. So I'll see you Tuesday. Everybody at home okay? lab time